As podcasters, there's many things that we wonder. Did our listeners like the content? What were they thinking after the episode? And also, where were they listening to the show? Well, Edison Research just released some data about podcast listenership that I know that you want to know. And of course, while a lot of this can be found out by having conversations one-on-one with our listeners or using specific tools, which I'll delve into this episode, I want to give you what is the overview of like the typical podcast listener, where they are, so that we can make better decisions that helps us not only with listener retention, but the episode consumption itself. So of course we have to dive into that. If we haven't met, hi, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the Podcast Space. I'm a podcast strategist that helps impact-driven business owners create content that not only gets them to their business goals, but also helps them stay visible without overwhelm. So let's dive right away. Before we get into this episode, I want to really make one little caveat. Podcast audiences vary, and it could be that your audience doesn't match this data that we're going to be talking about, but that is why being proactive does matter. So just listen to this episode with a little bit of grain of salt. Whether you just started your podcast journey or you've been podcasting for a while, there's a lot of unanswered questions that every time we publish our episode, we wish we had more data about it. So this data that I'm going to be talking about is going to be super helpful to help us create better content. And I'll be talking about as the episode goes, but I just want you to think about, where do you think your listeners consume your podcast? Are they driving in the car, waiting for their kids at a carpool? Are they walking at the park, listening to your show? Are they commuting to work? Are they at home? Well, according to Edison Research, and this study was just released right now in March 2025, the study does say that when we're looking at the percentage of like the daily podcast listening time in each location, the home comes first. And you're like, what's the percentage? Well, it's about 67%. So it's actually quite a lot. And of course, when we're looking at the amount of devices that we have in our house, we may have a TV, we may have a smart speaker or a regular speaker. So we're also likely to be multitasking. And so there's that chance that we want to be listening while we're doing something, right? We want to do something useful with our time. And so we're going to be listening to podcasts back then. And what I thought was really interesting, that I thought the car was going to come second, but actually the work comes second, with 16% of the listenership happening while at work. And then when we're looking at the car, it comes third. 11% of that podcast consumption happens while you're driving places. What I thought it was really interesting is that when we're in the car, of course, our attention is slightly fragmented, same as in the house. Remember, our listeners are not like propped in the couch, staring into the ceiling or the wall, listening to what we're saying, right? So when we're creating content that may include a lot of data, may include a lot of like complex ideas, or we want to help our listeners focus on that part of the interview, because maybe we're doing something that segues into a product pitch, we need to remember that our listeners are likely to be multitasking. Whether they're at house and at work or in the car, they're going to be doing something else. So it is important for us to give them verbal cues to focus on that part. Or if you're breaking down really complex numbers, to maybe repeat it again. And instead of saying, for instance, like the full number, saying like a round-up number, so that when they're listening, they can tune in instead of like zoning out. And again, this is something that the rest of the percentage, which is about 6%, is in other locations. So basically listening at the gym, grocery stores, or while walking. We know that according to the study in the US, people are going to be listening more at home. And so there's another element that I want you to consider is co-listening. I hear from so many listeners that are telling me like, hey, I listen to this podcast with my kids, right? Because we love listening to these podcasts, especially podcasts for kids or podcasts that are maybe like something in the news or something that is like uplifting and positive. Listeners may want to have their children with them or maybe their friend. And so I wanted to really trying to paint a picture of where our listeners may be. Now, this is where it gets more actionable. I'm not just telling you about like they're listening in the home, 67%. It's more than that. I want you to have this as a catalyst to start conversations with your listeners. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, this may not be perfect, but if you're listening on Spotify, there's the comment section that you can invite your listeners to let them know, hey, I would love to hear where you listen to my podcast. And not just where you listen to podcasts, because they may have a preferred place where they love to listen to you. And again, when we're driving places sometimes, and I know when I was living in Dallas, there were some podcasts that I was like, I'm too stressed out driving to be able to focus on this podcast. I need to listen to it maybe at home when there's like less stimulus. And it's really important to think about this when our listeners are basically sharing their time with us. And again, going onto YouTube and saying, hey, specifically, you listener, where do you listen to my podcast? Because the more we understand our listener habits, the better content we can create. And I'll give you a clear example. If you're looking at your consumption data and you're realizing that people are only listening to about 20 minutes, maybe that's when you're asking your audience, hey, comment below, where are you listening? How are you listening, right? You can understand that maybe their commute is shorter than your episodes. And therefore, when they get in the car again, they kind of don't feel like listening to that podcast again because the whole day went by, right? Or maybe their commute is not long enough. So having those conversations, do you see how like by asking those questions, we get more conversations going? Recently, I had conversations with two of my podcast listeners, and those two conversations were super insightful into some of not only the content strategy, but also like the brand and the words associated with my brand. Again, I'm not saying have conversations with your listeners on Zoom every single day, but try to make those conversations more routinely, if that's even a word, because it's better to help you craft content, because so much of what we're doing is in the unknown. So the more we understand how we're impacting our listeners, what takeaways are they getting, how they see our brand, the better content we're going to create. Plus, the more they're going to be talking about our podcast, the more they become super listeners, they advocate for our content, they share with a friend and family, right? So I want you to just remember, I'm just going to recap. In 2024, the US population, when we're looking at the percentage of total daily podcast listening time in each location, Edison Research told us that 67% happens at home, followed by work, 16%, car, 11%, and then 6% in other places like gyms, grocery stores, or walking. So I hope this podcast episode was what you needed in order to start having these conversations with your listeners, in order to ask yourself more questions, because we truly need to know more. I'm going to be releasing a lot of resources in the coming weeks, so make sure that you are subscribed to the Podcast Spaces newsletter. You can visit thepodcastspace.com and you can sign up over there. It's like the first thing you'll see when you land on the website, or from the show notes on this episode, you actually can subscribe as well, so that you never miss a resource that I'm sharing with you. So, as I said in this episode, I would love to know, where are you listening to this podcast? Where am I with you? What are we just together? Are you in the car? Are you in the house? Are you going for a grocery run? Like, tell me in the comments. And if your podcast app does not have a comment section, drop me a DM on Instagram. I'm at The Podcast Space. I cannot wait to hear from you. And of course, continue creating imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.